That's impossible. I can write about Wes's life post-2000 in a paragraph because his day doesn't change. You know, I haven't talked to Wes today, but I can tell you right now, just simply by looking at a clock, I can tell you what he's probably doing right now because I know his schedule. That's his life, and it has been for 13 years. So when the publisher first came up and they're like, you know, so why don't you write a book about your life since 2000? I said, well, that's not that interesting to me, frankly. And they're like, you know, so what will be the context? And he said, well, talk about, you know, kind of like the successes that you've had since then. And it really made me pause for a second. Because there's a difference between resume and success. There's a difference between a checklist or accomplishments or awards and what it really means to be successful. And I've come to understand that success without impact really isn't success at all. Success without actually making a marked difference on a fundamentally structural, troublesome entity, you haven't really understood what success is supposed to be. And so what I actually want to do is, I say that as a bit of context. I'm going to read a small part of this book as a, kind of because it was around this time that I was having, that the publisher and I first started having this conversation. And what I started to mean and understand and really started to think a little bit clearer about what this all meant. So, let me just find the right section. Oh, it says here. This is when I was now working in finance. And I was working over in London, and went to go see my grandmother who lived in the South Bronx. My grandparents lived in the South Bronx. And I talked about what that journey was like, going from my job in downtown Wall Street to go see my grandparents up in the South Bronx. And it says, nothing that is except the pride my family felt in my success. They really didn't have any idea of how well I was doing financially, nor did they care. The source of their pride and happiness never stemmed from that. They simply knew that 50 years earlier they'd come to the United States from Jamaica with only a vague concept of this American dream that everyone talked about. Their embrace of the American dream was even more remarkable because of my grandfather's painful history with this country. So what was this dream to them? They looked at where my sisters and I stood now, our opportunities and our cushier lifestyles, and all the sacrifices they had made seemed well worth it. And it was with that my grandparents began to understand what this meant to them. This dream was not simply about new opportunities that this country can afford you, but the happiness of watching your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren accomplish things that would have been impossible for you. It's watching with joy your sacrifices manifest in your loved ones living out their lives in peace and with unbridled opportunity. My success, such as it was their confirmation. One day while spending a month in New York working on a deal, I took the 45-minute subway ride up to the Bronx. The subway system in New York is amazingly efficient at showing off the jarring disparities between neighborhoods. One ride can bring you from the underbelly of poverty to the pinnacle of affluence, all for the price of a cup of coffee. I learned the route by heart. The number 2 train took me directly from my office on Wall Street to my grandparents' house off Gun Hill Road in the Bronx. The train rolled beneath the towering buildings of Lower Manhattan, the neon lights of Midtown, the upper suburbia of the Upper West Side, and the teeming street life of Harlem. 40 minutes after leaving an odorless, glass-sheathed downtown monolith, my nose was filled with the smell of oxtail and pig's feet as I walked into my grandparents' Bronx home. Some folks would literally turn up their noses at my family's choice of cuisine, but for me, it was comfort food. When I sat at my grandparents' dining room table and took the first large bite of gelatinous hoof, it was as if it had been seasoned with memory and marinated with love. So how's work? Mama Wynn's eyes danced and pride dripped from her voice as she asked the question. I had not fallen into any of the traps that lay outside their front door. I had survived my first 24 years when so many black men's lives were being snuffed out. And a kind of communal gratitude surrounded me, as it did every time I went home. It's going fine. I'm working hard, I replied between bites. Now tell me again, what is it exactly that you do? My grandfather asked. This made me pause my energetic chewing for a moment. I wasn't sure what to tell him. I was a banker, but that's not really what he was asking. He knew I worked at a bank. His question was less about the title and more about, well, the work. In some ways, he was asking me the question that I had been avoiding asking myself. I thought quickly. I was proud of the fact that as I had been taught and had repeated over and over in the halls of the bank, we added liquidity to the markets. Liquidity ensured that businesses and governments had the capital they required to serve the needs of their clients and constituents. This was not shameful work. It was essential, at least in the system as it currently exists. I knew my lines, but I didn't know how to share them with my grandparents. They had lived in the same home for almost a half century. My grandfather led congregations and my grandmother led classrooms. Their pride was in the honesty and necessity of their labor, not just in the particular complex economic system of the 21st century, but in a deeper, timeless way. People need faith. They need education. They always will. And that's what my grandparents did. They worked for other people in the most profound sense. That's what gave them their sense of pride. And they were proud of me too. Their pride was constant and powerful, even though they had no idea what I actually did. They were just proud that I was doing something and that I was trying. Before I could answer my grandfather's question, I was saved by my grandmother. She smiled at my grandfather and said, "Dear, you know he works at a bank. In fact, I'm going to tell Mrs. Johnson that she should go do her deposits with you." Mrs. Johnson was a neighbor who'd lived down the street from my grandparents for 35 years. My grandmother thought that I was a bank teller, that I could enter deposits on the 1st and the 15th of the month and get people their cash from their paychecks. She had no idea that I wouldn't know what to do with Mrs. Johnson's deposit slip. And she had no idea that Mrs. Johnson probably couldn't get in to give it to me anyway because she couldn't get past the security at the building where I worked. When they first said, "Then let's explore what it means to find your work," the reason why this book was important to me was because it was a journey that I had to go on myself. I had to first understand what it meant to go through that process before I could write about it for anyone else to follow. And so what I then tried to do was, in these stories, not just talk about the adventures but the misadventures of trying to find what that meant and what it looked like, and also juxtapose it with people who've inspired me to find my own work. How I go with the definition of the work is basically this. It's when your greatest joys and your greatest gifts begin to start overlapping with the world's greatest needs. And then you actually choose to do something about that. That's our work. It doesn't have to be our occupation, but it's our work. And I've come to understand that sometimes when people say, it's like, people say, so, where do you work? As if that's the most important question. Where do you work is not the most important question. What is your work is the question that lasts. And so in this story, I also highlight people like Cara Alley, a woman in Boston who was raised by a single mother who lived in poverty. And when Cara was 14 years old, her mother got a job. And without realizing it, that job ended up changing the trajectory of their entire family. Cara, later on, finished up school, became an entrepreneur. And one of the businesses that she started was a company called American Mojo. What American Mojo is, it's an apparel company, it's a clothing company. But she calls it American Mojo for a reason. The Mojo stands for Mothers and Jobs, because the only people she hires in her business are single mothers, most of whom will live in poverty. That's all she will hire. And she does it for a reason. One, because as she says, she loves the feeling of hearing the woman on the other side of the phone when she can call them and tell them, "I'll see you Monday." And the second, she does it because she does it as a tribute to her mother, where she wants to make sure that the same opportunity that one job that her mother got when she was 14 years old, that she can afford that same opportunity to countless other women. So she started American Mojo. I talk about a gentleman named Michael Hancock, who was living in Denver and came up in a very abusive in every single definition of the word, household as he was growing up. Shipped off from family member to family member. And Michael had one goal as he was growing up. leave Denver. Every negative idea that he had in his own mind all came back to this place. It came back to Denver. And his definition of success was the day that he could move out of Denver and never look back. Michael Hancock is currently the mayor of Denver, Colorado. Michael Hancock realized that the best way for him to actually deal with that level of pain and hurt was to run right to it. He said to himself, who would I be if after being afforded opportunities to now turn around and take a look at every single young Michael Hancock coming after me and not serve them and not try to give them an opportunity that I never had growing up? Who would I be? He had found his work in that. I highlight two of my friends, Dale Beatty and John Galena, two guys who grew up in Statesville, North Carolina together. And they graduated from high school, and right out of high school they ended up joining the National Guard together. And John was, while they weren't in the National Guard, John was a general contractor, and Dale was a cook, but as he calls it, a chef at Cracker Barrel. And one day they decided to go on active duty. They went off to Iraq together, and they were inside of the same Humvee, who was in a convoy in Iraq. And as the convoy was rolling down the street, an IED went off next to their vehicle and blew the vehicle 20 feet into the air. John was knocked out, but when John came to, he looked over and he saw his best friend dying next to him. When the medics finally came in, the medics were able to go in and pull Dale out. And they were able to save Dale's life, but they weren't able to save Dale's legs. And when Dale came home, he came back to Heroes Welcome back in Statesville, North Carolina. But what people didn't realize, it wasn't just Dale who was hurt in that vehicle that day, because John was the only one in the vehicle with no physical injuries. But John dealt with very severe survivor's guilt, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and eventually John became suicidal. And the only person that noticed was Dale. And John would always tell Dale, it's my fault. If there's anything I can do, please let me know. And Dale says, it's not your fault. But as Dale saw how hurt John was, one day Dale went to go see John. And he said, you know how you always say that if I need help to let you know? And John's like, yes, anything. And he says, well, I want to build homes for service-disabled veterans. And John kind of looks at Dale and says, how are you going to build homes? You have no legs. And Dale says, but you do. And they first started off by building a small ramp for a Vietnam veteran who they knew in Statesville. And they turned into an organization called Purple Heart Homes that now literally goes around the country building homes for service-disabled veterans. They have found their work. This idea that the things that gives you the most joy is also the thing that heals the world. And they act on it. And they do it. That's what this exploration was, and that's what I hoped for this exploration could be. Because oftentimes, as we're thinking about this bigger definition of what exactly does it mean, I've come to fully appreciate and understand the fact that we have but so much time here. And while we're here, let's actually do something with it. While we're here, let's have some fun. And that'll lead to another small part, and I'll close with this, but and I'll give a bit of context on this piece that I'll read very quickly. It was about something that we're doing with Harry Belafonte with MSNBC, and it talked a bit about kind of who he was, and the fact that when you think about things like, for example, the letter from a Birmingham jail that people know Dr. King for, which in my opinion is, I think, one of the maybe the top 5 pieces of American canon that we've ever seen. And but it talked about how when Dr. King was first arrested for being unruly, when he went down to Birmingham, how when he was sitting in prison, how there was an op-ed written by members of the clergy. and the members of the clergy who were down in Birmingham wrote this letter basically saying how Dr. King coming down to Birmingham was not helpful or useful, and it was him and a series of other people, Ralph Abernathy. And it was not helpful or useful because they called him in the op-ed an outside agitator. And they said that his being there was not actually helping to advance the cause. There's a group of clergy. And Dr. King, someone gave him this op-ed while he was sitting in prison, and Dr. King decided to write him, and he wrote this amazing letter that turned into the letter from a Birmingham jail. But the first thing he said, if I responded to everything that people wrote about me, I wouldn't have time to actually do any of my work. But he said, but I chose to respond to this because since you are members of the clergy, I figure where you're coming was from a place of peace, and so I want to respond. And then he then proceeded to take down every single one of their arguments in this letter, which is still amazing to me because he didn't do it in front of a computer or in front of a library or in a bookstore. He did it from a prison cell, and it's gorgeous, this letter that he wrote. But the person that bailed him out was Harry Belafonte, that bailed him out of Birmingham. And so I use that as a context for this. I was guest co-hosting Morning Joe one morning, the MSNBC staple that kicks off the cable channel's morning programming. Sitting with Willie Geist, a good friend and one of the most talented people on television, I looked over the schedule of events and saw that Harry Belafonte was going to be a guest in the 8 o'clock hour. Harry Belafonte was revered in my home when I was growing up. Of Jamaican descent, he introduced the world to his unique West Indian mix of fun-loving calypso and soulful ballads. He was also a heartthrob and a fine actor, and his combination of talents made him a star. But my grandparents' admiration went past his Jamaican heritage, his smooth baritone, or in my grandmother's case, his tight pants. They admired him because he was passionate about making his celebrity mean something. What many didn't realize was that when Harry Belafonte was not entertaining crowds, he was supporting many of the important civil rights issues of the day. When Martin Luther King Jr. needed someone to bail him out of the Birmingham jail, it was Harry Belafonte who came to his aid. Belafonte staked his personal wealth and risked his career to support Dr. King and the civil rights movement. Indeed, Belafonte suffered professionally. He was blacklisted and targeted by the FBI, but he never stopped. His activism continued for decades, helping raise money for humanitarian interventions all over Africa, working to bring down apartheid, and speaking out against American wars, including the one I fought in myself. He was a brilliant entertainer who leveraged his fame and wealth for the things he believed in, even when it cost him. He was a model of activism, humanitarianism, and fearless dissent. As Mr. Belafonte slowly strode onto the set, his still regal frame, smooth skin, and youthful features belied the fact that he was a man in his mid-80s. He smiled, showing off the legendary grin that had won him millions of fans. We shook hands, and soon we were live on the air. He was talking about the new book he had completed about his life. He spoke about his entertainment career, but the conversation quickly turned to politics and the midterm elections that were fast approaching. He spoke with more passion about health disparities and economic inequality than he did about his performances at Radio City or at Carnegie Hall. When it came time for me to pose a question, I asked him where his underlying passion for social issues had come from. Was it his immigrant history? Maybe his interracial marriage that helped to shape his outlook? Was it living through the civil rights era and seeing how many of the people who were listening to his songs were still drinking from separate water fountains or eating at separate food counters? He broke out into his famous grin again and softly chuckled. He told me it was just more fun to live that way. That wasn't the answer that I'd been expecting. Think about it, he continued. Some celebrities wake up and call their accountants. I wake up and call Nelson Mandela. Who do you think has a more interesting life? I realized throughout this journey that all of our own individual work, it's a search. And the only thing that we can do with that search is then use our time and our energy to unearth where that work is, no matter where it might hide itself. Because it just helps us to live, as Mr. Belafonte said, to live a more interesting life. So I'm incredibly thankful for all of you and for your time tonight and for your individual work as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if it's okay, if anybody has any thoughts.
Questions? Yeah, we definitely have time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
I think it was Terry Gross that I heard you on this week.
Yes.
You spoke about someone, and I think it was a mentor of yours. You said you'd had many mentors, and your grandfather was probably one of the first ones. But
Yes, ma'am.
this one talked to you about the value of your work and what it meant, and that seemed to have really made you start thinking about this. And can you quote what he said again?
Yes,
I thought it was, and I remember wanting to go back and listen to the podcast again because I wanted to share that with my son.
Absolutely. So it was I will never forget this. So it was a gentleman named Bill Brody, who was the former president of Johns Hopkins University. He's actually now at the Salk Institute. And I remember I was just leaving Washington. I was just finishing my White House fellowship, and he wanted to get together to talk about what I was going to do next. And so when I went to go see him, I was explaining to him, well, I just got an offer, and I'm excited to tell you that I'm going to, go to work on Wall Street. And his response was, really? And I told him, I said, that's not the response I was expecting from you. I thought he'd be more excited. And he was like, listen, and he's like, just tell me why is that what you're choosing to do? And again, this wasn't an indictment on the industry. But I explained to him why I wanted to do it, and I told him because I wanted to build out the skill set, and I told him that I have real family responsibilities I have to do. I'm still helping out with my grandmother. I'm still helping out with my mom. All these kind of things. And he said, listen, Wes. He said, I'm never going to judge you or question you on the decisions that you want to make professionally. I get it. He said, but the day you feel like you've gotten what you need to get out of there, leave. Because every day that you stay longer, you become extraordinarily ordinary. And when he said that, it was like, it was like just taking your soul and rattling it, right? You become extraordinarily ordinary. And again, it wasn't an indictment on the industry. He wasn't saying don't do that for whatever different various reasons. He was simply saying,
live to your potential.
Live to your potential. Find what it is that you're supposed to be doing and do it. Because also the thing I realized too, and it's actually really cool when you think about it, if you think about people who are really great at what they do, really great, what's the one thing that all of them have in common? It's not what industry they're in, it's not what type of family they grew up in, it's not what part of the country they're from or part of the world that they're from. The one thing that all of them have in common is they are so passionate about what they do. That's what makes them great at it. And I've come to realize if you're not passionate, you will never be great. I've never seen anyone who's great at what they do, and when you ask them about it, and really great, like great at what they do, and when you ask them about it, they go, it's okay. Right? That's the one thing that really all of them have in common. They are passionate about their work. And so you kind of figure, and I think what President Brody was alluding to, is go for greatness. And the only way that you're going to do that is if you care deeply about your work. If you care deeply about what it is that you are going to do. And so I remember, after spending some years up there, when it was time to kind of make the decision that I wanted to leave. And it was a hard decision because, this was at a time, again, I'd seen, we were right in the middle of the depths of the financial crisis and all that kind of stuff. I remember talking to my friends, and one friend in particular, who was telling me, you do understand what's going on out there, right? You do understand if you leave, you're not going to be welcome back. Right, you can't tell them, I'm going to take some time off to go find myself and then think there's going to be a job waiting for you when you come back. And so he was really against me leaving. But I told him, I said, I can't stay any longer. And he wished me the best, and I kind of gave it back to the same thing about if you're not great at it, why are you doing it? And I say this with no glee, but literally 6 months later, I got a phone call from him telling me that he was then laid off from that same job. This was it was a decision that I think back on, and President Brody's words continue to sit with me, that the goal is greatness. No matter where that greatness hides itself, that's the goal. And the only way to get there is if you're passionate about it. Because if not, you'll become extraordinarily ordinary.
Is that story in the book by any chance?
It is.
Excellent.
That story,
My son just got to get up.
that story is in the book, and actually, and even after, as I'm talking about what was happening in the detail, and that's actually one thing, you know, in fact, someone was saying about the book, they're like, in some ways, it's also kind of it's an interesting illustration of what's happened over the past decade, because, you know, I've been blessed, you know, in some ways that you kind of served as like a first-hand witness in some of these striking things that were happening over the past decade. You know, when you are living, when literally 9/11 happens, and then 2 weeks later, I'm flying overseas to go start a Rhodes Scholarship. And so you're watching both you're watching what happened on that day from a first-hand perspective, and then 2 weeks later, from a perspective of how the world is then reacting and responding to it, because you're sitting in, you know, England having these debates with people. You know, being a paratrooper in Afghanistan, a first-hand witness. You know, serving in an administration as they were trying to sort all this stuff out, sort all this stuff out. You know, working on Wall Street and getting a phone call from a friend one Sunday night telling me, he's like, you know, hey Wes, and he just sounds shell-shocked, and he said, my job is gone. And I thought he meant his job, and he's like, you don't understand. My job is gone. Lehman is liquidating tomorrow. And what that meant throughout the duration of the next couple of years, of starting with that one phone call from my friend that I talk about here, when he tells me that Lehman Brothers is no more, and what that meant to the world. So all these things, as you stand here as a first-hand witness of it, and then what the takeaways from those things are as well.
So these things that you just mentioned that we went through, and you in particular were a first-hand witness to, many of them are difficult, and in some cases, what is the word you use? Stuff, or they're not. These are difficult times, troubled times. There's reason to be therefore quite concerned. Yet I'm going to guess that you're an optimist. And can you share with us the reasons why you're an optimist? And as we talk about terrible events that changed us adversely, can you give us examples of? You've given some of them from the book. But what gives you hope? What are the events, and what do you hope is going to happen?
Another great question. Both great questions. You know what I think keeps me optimistic is, as I wake up in the morning, I just try to keep my eyes open, because there are people doing extraordinary things all around us. Amazing work, and with headwinds that are coming 100 miles an hour at them, and they just dig in a little deeper, and they keep on pushing. And that's what gives me hope. What gives me hope is the work that we do. We have a platform called Bridge to You, where we work with students, and basically we try to address the college completion crisis by reinventing the freshman year. Completely restructuring the freshman years, because all statistics show is that's actually a choke point for most students. What's unbelievable nationally, for all students to start college in their freshman year, 34% will not make it past their freshman year, or will not re-enroll for their sophomore year. And part of it is financial, which is some, but that's actually the much smaller thing. The bigger issues are things like academic remediation, need for academic remediation, which by the way costs the same as a student who's taking full credit load. So you'll have a student who's paying a full amount for tuition, but at the end of the year ends up with like 3 credits because of the need for academic remediation, which is around 60% in the country right now for kids who graduate from high school. And the other one is the social transition. Kids who are literally walking onto a college campus, and within months they say, I don't belong here. And oftentimes by Thanksgiving they're home. And so I think about the student who we work with, who showed up 40 minutes late for class. And when you begin to ask him why he showed up late, it's because he couldn't afford a bus pass that month. And he walked. He walked 3.5 miles from his house to get to school. He was 40 minutes late, but he showed up. I think about the people who I know who are working every day with kids involved in the juvenile justice system, a population that oftentimes is completely forgotten about and neglected, and it almost becomes simply a farm system for the adult prison system. And every single day they show up because they know one core fact about the population that they're working with is that kids need to think that you care before they care what you think. And so what gives me hope and what gives me optimism is that the people that I try to surround myself with have hope and optimism. And so why would I not have it? Why would I not be inspired by it? I just try to keep my eyes open. This stuff is hard and I'm not naive. Requires real work. It requires real patience. It requires real forgiveness. But that's where the joy lies. Because I guess I've come to also think that anything that's easy by nature, or anything that's done with ease as a motivation for doing it, has, at least in my life, has never been worth doing. We do the hard stuff because it needs to get done. And that's where the joy is. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You started off the conversation sharing the experience of the other Wes Moore, living in a similar neighborhood, and I guess some background, obviously radically different paths in life. So what do you ascribe to the differences?
That question was actually one of the big things that I was trying to even explore with Wes. And so first let me say, so I'm still in very close touch with Wes. I just saw Wes last week. And I do know there are some people who have a problem with that. And one thing I just say, and this with all due respect, is I know why Wes is in prison, and I don't need a reminder of why he was there. Wes has made some horrific and unforgiving decisions in his life. But the couple things that I know about Wes is that, one, I didn't reach out to Wes to write a book, so I don't know why now that the book is written, why I would stop reaching out to him. And the other thing that I learned was that even our worst decisions never separate us from the circle of humanity. If we're not willing to learn from Wes or lives like his, we're just doomed to keep on repeating this stuff. And as I was thinking about what some of the big differences were, you can't understand my story, his story, without understanding the role that family plays in it, faith plays in it, housing plays in it, all that kind of stuff plays into it. But I think there's one bigger overarching thing, and Wes actually pointed it out to me, was I remember I went to go see him once, and I asked Wes, I said, so do you think they were products of our environments? We both grew up in the same areas, all that kind of stuff. And I heard that so much when I was growing up, that people were products of their environments, I hear that so much that I never questioned it. I just kind of swallowed it and said, that's the case, people are products of their environments. And Wes looked at me and he said, actually, I think we're products of our expectations. And I thought to myself, he's absolutely right. We're not products of our environments, we're products of our expectations. And someone once said to me, it's a real shame that you lived up to your expectations and Wes didn't. And I said, actually, the real shame is that we both did. Because the expectations that people have of themselves don't come from nowhere. The expectations that people have of themselves come from the expectations that other people have of them. And they just simply internalize them and they make them their own. And so, I don't care if we're talking about the State House, I don't care if we're talking about Capitol Hill, I don't care if we're talking about a Fortune 100 company or a military organization, or I don't care if we're talking about the state penitentiary. All of them are full of people who lived up to their expectations. And so I think if we want to really move the needle on so many of these issues, are there policy changes that need to be made? Absolutely. Are there structural changes that need to be addressed to better support and help kids navigate that process? Because also the one thing I know is, raising kids is amazingly complicated, and if you happen to be raising kids in some of the most precarious communities of our country, it is that much more complicated. And I tell you, I'll debate with anyone who wants to tell me that every child is born with the same amount of assets. Because anybody who believes that, there are some communities in this state alone that I would love to take you to. I believe deeply that, that potential is universal, but opportunity is not. But as we think about that, we can make all the structural law changes that we want. If we're not changing the psychological expectations that people have for themselves and that other people have of them, then we will continue to see disparities. We'll continue to see different results. We have to understand that if we don't have the same expectations for every child, regardless of their background, regardless of where they come from, then we cannot scratch our heads when the disparities show themselves as they get older.
Forget a second question. You've been in the White House. You've worked at that level. You've worked on Wall Street with, I'm sure, some very well-to-do people who have great means to potentially make a difference. And yet, it's puzzling sometimes when somebody has so much ability to make a change, like, for example, on Wall Street, or, for example, President Bush, that they're not pulling in the right direction. They're not exercising what you might consider to be the better part of themselves. They're whatever reason giving into greed or selfishness or lack of care. What is your sense of that issue? What can we do for people who have the means to make a difference? How can we encourage them?
So it's
And did you ever encounter that in the White House where he said, "Excuse me, we might be able to do something"?
Oh yeah.
Oh, you did.
No, all the time, and I think that's something that you realize about policymaking. So much of policymaking is about prioritization, right? It's about what are we going to make the issues that we're going to spend the most time on and put the most resources towards, and that is that's the sausage of policymaking, because that's the fight. The fight is about, with a finite amount of resources, who's going to get what, and how are we going to disseminate properly to make sure that we're, and one thing I say about policymakers, and I'll just policymakers for example right now, I think the vast majority of them are actually very good. I think the majority of them actually genuinely are good people who care and who are sacrificing a lot personally for their families, etc., to do the work that they do. So I have a lot of admiration. I don't agree with them a lot on conclusions, but I actually think the majority of them do care deeply. The question is that how can we add that sense of humanity in terms of the policy and positions that they're actually going to make? Because oftentimes I feel like that gets lost. And honestly, I have more of a quantitative mind than a qualitative mind. Like, I like numbers, I like data, but I also do understand that statistics can add context, but it's stories that promote action.
Exactly.
We can never forget the humanity of what we're talking about. I remember when I was putting together the Other Westmore, at first I was going to make it like the 10-step prescriptive guide. Like, here are the 10 things that every parent or mentor should do. And I remember the publisher said to me, they said, "Wes, that sounds really interesting and all, but I'm going to be honest with you. No one wants to read a parenting book by a 30-year-old with no children." And I was like, that's actually a really good point. And that's when they said, just tell the stories. And people will understand the points that you're trying to make without feeling like you're trying to beat them over the head with things. So I think we have to do that and help people to understand the humanity behind it. I think the other thing we have to do is we have to trend towards people's natural inclinations of self-service by helping them to understand that this is not just about them. It's about you. So for example, the program we were talking about earlier, STAND, we work with kids involved in the juvenile justice system in Baltimore. So generally, first and second time offenders who range from the ages of 8 years old to 13 years old, oftentimes for nonviolent offenses, oftentimes drugs. We work with them to try to befriend them, tutor them, get them back into school, which is a whole other issue with kids who get involved in the juvenile justice system. We can go for days about that. But one of the things that we do is we even think about that from a policy perspective is we also try to get people there and we try to expose them to people from different backgrounds, different lifestyles who are doing different jobs, that kind of thing. And I have a good buddy of mine who's an engineer. And I told him, I was like, do you mind if I spend 15 minutes with our kids and just tell them, he's like, I want you to tell them what you do every day. I just want to expose them because they probably never met an engineer before in their life. And he's like, listen, Wes, he's like, I applaud the work that y'all do. But he said, my community service is I take care of my family. And he's got 3 wonderful daughters. He is an amazing father. And he's like, but that's my contribution, are these 3 girls. And I told him, I said, listen, I hear you, and he is an amazing father, but I told him, I was like, how are you helping your daughters when they live in a community when you need them home as soon as the lights come on because you don't trust them to be home at night? How are you helping your daughters when they go to a school that has a 51% graduation rate? How are you helping your daughters when at some point when they're going to try to find someone who they want to spend the rest of their life with, and 65% of the young men in this area are either on some form of supervision or have some form of record? How are you helping them? And so I guess the point that I wanted to try to make with him was, even if you're not going to do it to be selfless, do it to be selfish. Because it just helps us live in a better community. Because we can never have an honest conversation about the future of our communities if only a sliver of the population is part of the conversation. And we can never have an honest conversation about the future of our communities if only a sliver of the population is even being thought about in those conversations. The reason we want inclusive and the reason we want, true transformational conversations is not just because we want to become Mother Teresa. It's because we all want to live in a more prosperous and welcoming society. So that's why. So I would say for those folks in the kind of the folks on Wall Street or whoever who's trying to figure out what it is that they want to do, or even if they should or how they want to get involved, find your passion points and then choose to do it, because it makes our communities better, which will make your life better.
I didn't hear what your role was with the Bush administration, but gathering by your other context of conversation and your association with the Obama administration, or the Obama campaign, I presume you weren't always on the same side of the Bush administration folks.
I've been always on the same side of the Obama administration either.
Either way then. So what sort of conflicts did you reach in your role, and how did you resolve getting along with others?
So when I was working with the Bush administration and working specifically with Secretary Rice, it was with a program called the White House Fellowship. And the White House Fellowship every single year selects around 12 people, mid-career professionals, to go serve as a senior level advisor to a cabinet official in the White House. And really what they want to bring people from a wide variety of backgrounds and have them see what the policy making process is like, and to serve in it. It was started by Lyndon Johnson, and it has been continued by every single president since. And when I was in Afghanistan, I remember I was coming back from a mission. I wrote about it, I was coming back from a night mission. And as we were coming back from this night mission in Afghanistan, Sergeant Johnson, who was one of my NCOs, said, "Hey sir, Colonel Fenzel needs to see you." And so Colonel Fenzel was also a good friend of mine. I'd known Mike Fenzel for years. He's an amazing, amazing guy. But he was also the Deputy Brigade Commander of the 82nd Airborne when we were overseas. And I go to see Colonel Fenzel, come in, he's like, "Take a seat." Go take a seat. He's like, "How's it going?" It's going all right. He asked about the mission, told him all about it. And he said, "Listen, I need you to apply for the White House Fellowship next year." He was a former White House fellow. And we were talking a bit about it, but basically his point was this. He said, there's an amazing disconnect between, oftentimes, and I don't think this is exclusive to an administration or a party, between the ones who make the policy and the ones who have to implement it. And he's like, the folks in Washington need to see what you have seen. They need to know what you have learned over this past, at that point it was 6 months. We were in the theater at 6 months. Like, we still have another 6 months to go. And I went and thought about it, decided to apply for the White House Fellowship, and then weeks after I came back from Afghanistan, after we redeployed, I had my finalist interview and then ended up getting this White House Fellowship. So it's a non-political, non-partisan appointment, but you work with that cabinet level official and see how they actually implement the policies. And one thing I'd say about Secretary Rice is, and again, almost regardless of where the conclusion is, and whether you agree or disagree with the conclusion, the level of thoughtfulness I thought she actually put into the decisions was actually really refreshing. And more than I thought, honestly, before I walked into that role. I mean, this was a person who was up at, 4 o'clock in the morning, every morning. Was working out at 4, was at the State Department by 6, was at the White House at 7 for the PDB, for the presidential daily briefings, and then her day kind of went at that pace until about 10:30 at night when she went home. I had never seen anything like that before, at that level and at that pace. But I also learned that for the people who are making the policy decisions, there needs to be an understanding and a context of what's happening on the ground. Because oftentimes we can put up these grand platitudes about the world we want and the world we hope to create. But if we don't have our feet on the ground as well, and we just are staying up in the clouds, then then that disconnect is real. And quite honestly, the things that we do don't always get seen as altruism. In fact, in many cases, it gets seen as the absolute opposite, which makes things a whole lot tougher in the long run as well. But that was the context in which I was working there. And then it's a year fellowship. I had a chance to stay on for that year to stay on the State Department, and I decided that I needed to go. I needed to do something different. And that's when I went to go see President Brody, who loved my decision to leave there and go into finance.
Thank you, Wes. We need to get to some signings. So
Okay.
thank you so much for being here tonight.
Well, this is my honor. Thank you, all. Seriously.